Archangel Michael says, "The hush before dawn carries the weight of a world that forgets to listen, and in that hush a single promise trembles with the power to awaken the brave." The scene begins in a suspended breath where shadows lean close and hearts, long hardened by noise, remember the sound of conscience. The narrative will move like a river that knows its course, carrying truth that refuses to drown beneath comfortable lies. A cold wind threads through alleys of regret and through halls where decisions were made without care, and the wind brings a clear demand for change. The speaker stands firm at the edge of memory and possibility, tracing with steady fingers the map of what must be undone and what must be sown anew. The tone is neither gentle martyrdom nor bitter accusation, but the precise force that rights a ship that has drifted dangerously off course. The message opens with a sense of suspension to catch the reader in a pause long enough to feel the shift, and that pause becomes the hinge on which the entire story swings. The words that follow are measured and exact, shaped to cut through distraction and to lodge like a beacon in the skull of anyone who refuses to turn away. The voice is sovereign and calm, prepared to call each soul to account and to offer a path that leads away from ruin. The presence is not distant but immediate, like the press of a hand at the small of the back guiding the stumbling traveler forward. There is no sermon, only clarity and consequence, and every clause is designed to awaken courage and responsibility. The intention is to create a corridor of light through which choices can pass and be transformed into new outcomes. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. A city of small compromises stands under a pall of choices left unexplored, and the air hums with the low frequency of deferred justice. The voice names what people usually hide from themselves and does so without triumph, only with the resolution of a sentinel fulfilling duty. There is an insistence that balance be restored and that the scales, long tilted by neglect or greed, be tended until they hold true weight again. The speaker urges a return to fidelity, not to a past that cannot be reclaimed but to principles that endure beyond convenience. The appeal is to integrity in its most practical form, acts performed when no one else watches, words kept steady in the absence of praise. Each image is concrete, intended to turn idealism into habit by showing how small choices build the architecture of a life. The narrative refuses to indulge in easy absolution and instead offers repair as a disciplined work of hands and heart. It calls for the mending of what was torn and the harvesting of what was ignored, aligning action with care in a way that produces real consequence. The voice makes clear that repair is possible, but not without honest labor and costly correction. There is a cadence to the warnings that feels almost like a clock. Precise and unyielding, and the rhythm makes intent unmistakable. This is not a threat offered in anger, but a forecast issued by someone who has authority to see the end of choices before they arrive. The listener is invited to change course and thus to convert impending ruin into a future that is both safer and more generous. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. A household of whispered fears sits in the dark and hears the call as if from another chamber in the same house, and it cannot ignore the pull that asks for reconciliation. The tone shifts to practical guidance, explaining how to step back into right relation with neighbors, with institutions, and with private truths. Each directive is grounded in action: speak plainly, return what is owed, repair what was broken, and hold to promises once given. The message resists melodrama and instead names the ordinary sins that accumulate like dust, and it insists on ritual cleansing through consistent, humble practice. The remedy is not dramatic spectacle but persistent attention to the small courtesies and steadfast repairs that knit communities back together. The language exhorts, with steady patience, to take up those small tasks that are the scaffolding of trust. There is also a stern insistence that those who hold power must not shelter behind status while others shoulder the consequences of poor decisions. The instruction favors accountability over theatrical shaming and encourages institutions to enact transparent processes that restore faith through clarity rather than rhetoric. The tone is neither vindictive nor permissive, but anchored in the conviction that justice must be practical and repeatable. The voice announces that restoration begins where harm was first permitted to flourish, and it points to the places where attention can have the quickest effect. It is a map to immediate repair that asks only for willingness to act and the humility to accept correction. In every line a practical path is sketched toward re-establishing what the community once held sacred. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. An individual who has lived by closed doors and secret bargains hears the call and understands that privacy can never be a shelter for deeds that harm others. The narrative addresses the private sinner with the same uncompromising clarity it offers to public wrongdoers, reminding each person that secrecy amplifies harm while confession begins repair. The tone is tender toward the human failing but unsparing about what it costs to continue in denial. There is a stepwise counsel for restoring personal integrity, starting with naming the harm, then making restitution where possible, and finally altering behavior so that new harm cannot easily recur. The steps are described plainly, as if the speaker is a seasoned craftsman teaching a novice a reliable repair technique. The methodical pacing reassures the listener that repair is a sequence that can be learned and practiced. The script insists that confession alone is not enough, action must follow to rebuild the trust that words cannot alone restore. The voice prescribes specific forms of restitution: return, repair, recalibrate relationships, and commit to public accountability when private wrongs have public effects. This framework is offered as a moral toolkit rather than a theological demand, designed to be useful and effective. The guidance extends to the restoration of reputation in measured ways that avoid theater but secure tangible change, and the strategy privileges enduring practices over symbolic gestures. The voice cautions against quick fixes and invites the disciplined work that yields reliable transformation over time. There is a calmness in the instruction that reassures while requiring resolve. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. Archangel Michael says, "Now the script widens to speak of leaders and those whose decisions ripple across many lives, and it weighs the gravity of responsibility that comes with influence." The passage lays out the burdens of leadership and the clarity that must guide leaders when stakes are high and outcomes are precarious. The tone calls for humility as the first requirement of leadership and for service as its guiding star. The instructions to leaders are concrete and enforceable: act with foresight, consult widely, remediate promptly, and never hide risk from those affected by your choices. The text rejects prideful secrecy and rewards transparency with renewed legitimacy. Every sentence is crafted to remind leaders that power deserts those who misuse it and steadies those who steward it responsibly. There is also a firm admonition about the consequences of ignoring counsel and rushing decisions for short-term gain. The words describe how small miscalculations can compound into large harms and how leaders must therefore be guardians of pause and deliberation. The script provides scenarios where thoughtful delay and consultation prevent catastrophe and where rashness, unchecked, invites breakdown. Leaders are asked to institute mechanisms of corrective feedback and to model the humility that allows for correction without loss of dignity. The voice prescribes structures that enable mistakes to be caught early and repaired quickly, protecting the many from the arrogance of a few. This is presented as a practical architecture for sustainable governance. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. Communities are addressed with a call to mutual care that rejects indifference as the silent accomplice of harm. The script envisions neighborhoods and organizations as living organisms that require regular tending, and it offers simple routines that maintain their health. These routines include meeting to listen, rotating tasks to prevent burnout, and naming shared values allowed to keep them active. The speaker instructs groups to create cultures where apology and repair are normalized rather than shunned, and where accountability is not a sword but a shared tool for restoration. The language models how to hold someone accountable with dignity and how to accept accountability without collapse. This fosters resilience and keeps relationships functional even in hardship. There is a focus on practical institutions that sustain mutual aid, local councils, restorative circles, and clear systems for resource distribution. The script emphasizes that strong institutions are not built by heroics but by reliable processes that persist beyond any single person. The voice counsels steadiness, ritualized care, and the deliberate passing down of practices to new generations. Finally, in this section the text stresses that culture is made concrete through repeated acts, and it charges readers to practice the small rituals that shape larger identity. The voice calls for courage to alter routines when they harm and for clarity in choosing traditions that uplift rather than degrade. The lesson is that culture can be reclaimed by intention and tended by everyday acts of integrity. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. A parent hears the admonition and is told to place the welfare of the child above every personal convenience, recognizing that love is measured most clearly by sacrifice and presence. The paragraph instructs parents to repair by being consistent, to discipline with fairness, and to model the courage required for ethical life. It presents parenting as a moral apprenticeship where habits are transmitted through example rather than sermon. Children are depicted as mirrors that amplify the virtues and vices of their caretakers, and the speaker insists that raising the next generation is a public trust that demands fidelity. The guidance includes teaching practical responsibility, holding to promises made to young people, and acknowledging mistakes quickly so trust can be rebuilt. The text rejects neglect as a social crime and elevates attentive care as the true currency of parenthood. This section also speaks to mentors and teachers with instructions to protect the vulnerable and to use authority to enlarge opportunity instead of gatekeeping it. The voice is precise: guard access, elevate the marginalized, and wield expertise as a bridge rather than a barrier. The tone is firm, imbuing duty with compassion. The final lines remind caregivers that repair to relationships with the young is among the most potent investments in a better future and calls for practical, everyday fidelity. The Council frames these acts as both moral and strategic, for the strength of a society rises with the well-being of its children. The voice suggests practical habits that produce durable trust. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. A laborer and a steward each receive instruction about respect for work and the dignity of honest labor, urging a dismissal of contempt for any task that contributes to communal life. The text honors the sweat of hands and the creativity of minds alike, and it insists that honorable reward and fair treatment are not negotiable. The language calls for systems that compensate labor justly and punish exploitation clearly. The script outlines measures to rebuild workplaces where trust and safety are central, recommending transparent grievance processes, shared decision-making, and clear standards for ethical conduct. The voice stresses that productive collaboration requires reciprocal respect and that leaders must be held to those standards. The narrative offers practical remedies rather than rhetorical platitudes. Workers are called to integrity as well, to perform duties conscientiously and to report harms in systems that protect them. The balanced approach refuses to sanctify either the powerful or the powerless, demanding instead mutual accountability. The voice provides a framework for workplaces to become places of dignity once again. In closing this section, the speaker encourages communities to honor the built world by maintaining it, repairing infrastructure, and respecting the labor that keeps systems running. The small acts of repair in daily life are described as sacred duties that cumulatively prevent decay and injustice. The tone is resolute and encouraging. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. Cities and nations are addressed with a stern but practical pedagogy about law, justice, and the equitable distribution of resources, and the voice insists that policy must mirror moral clarity. The message denounces policies that favor a few at the expense of many and prescribes redistribution where necessary to re-establish balance. The script advocates measured, lawful corrections rather than chaotic redistribution, framing justice as restoration rather than vindictive retribution. Economic systems are urged to reward contribution and to prevent the consolidation of power that silences dissent and corrodes fairness. The speaker offers concrete directives: transparent taxation used for common goods, accountable public spending, and protections for the vulnerable. These are described as the bones of a healthy polity, without which society weakens. The passage decries cynical governance that treats citizens as obstacles rather than stewards and calls on institutions to return to public service as their central aim. The voice outlines administrative reforms that preserve dignity, encourage participation, and reduce concentration of corrupting influence. The tone is practical and unflinching, recommending clear measures to safeguard the common good. Finally, the script exhorts nations to remember the human cost behind statistics and to legislate with empathy and foresight so that policies heal rather than wound. It insists on compassion as a political principle that yields durable stability and reduces cycles of harm. The appeal is grounded in realism and moral imagination. Type Amen to get blessing all different like 333. The text turns to those who traffic in lies and manipulation, stating plainly that deception erodes the foundations of any society and will be met with the corrective force of truth. The voice does not delight in punishment but affirms that persistent falsehoods demand exposure and repair. The pattern described for dealing with deceit is rigorous investigation, transparent disclosure, and consistent consequence. There is a practical manual for restoring trust to communications, clear sourcing, public correction of errors, and protections for whistleblowers who risk much to reveal truth. The guidance insists on structures that make lies costly and truth practical, reducing incentives to hide real intentions. The tone is both pragmatic and moral, aligning accountability with survival. Propaganda is named as a corrosive agent that weaponizes belief for private ends, and the script prescribes public education that strengthens critical thinking and civic literacy. The aim is to empower citizens to evaluate claims, not merely to rebut them, thereby creating a resilient public square. The voice trusts in reason and insists on institutions that cultivate it. The closing lines of this part demand that those who profit from falsehood must be prevented from doing so again through transparent sanctions and restitution where harm was done. The remedy is comprehensive and designed to restore informational ecosystems so they may serve common flourishing. The overall posture combines firmness with a plan for repair. Type A men to get blessing all different like 333. Those who have been harmed are addressed with recognition and an offer of practical avenues for redress, and the text refuses to minimize pain while refusing to let it calcify into endless bitterness. Restorative practices are recommended as the primary path, centering the harmed in processes that yield both accountability and healing. The voice encourages participation in repair rather than settling for merely punitive outcomes. Concrete mechanisms are detailed: community panels for restitution, funded support services, and timelines for healing that are realistic and resourced. The script insists that systems of recovery must be sustained, not episodic, and that long-term commitments are necessary for durable well-being. The tone is compassionate and action-focused. Reintegration is emphasized as a public good, not a concession, and the speaker insists on programs that help those harmed regain agency and dignity. The narrative outlines vocational training, mental health resources, and community sponsorship as pillars of sustained recovery. The approach privileges empowerment over dependency. This section ends with a clear call to fund and institutionalize these remedies so that healing becomes a standard response rather than a rare privilege. By doing so, communities build their own immunity to cycles of harm and repair. The voice offers hope grounded in pragmatic commitments. Type A men to get blessing all different like 333.